Have you ever been on podcasts before? Because I was trying to find you on like the alternative data podcast or whatever else. I couldn't.
Mark is never going to forgive me for this because he's asked quite a few times, and I have tried to run it up the flagpole, and they were kind of very hedgy about it for reasons that I don't fully understand. And now when he finds out about this, I'm going to have to ask again because no, I have not done that. This is the first non-live event that I have done for things. And so, yes, but to be fair, I've known you a lot longer than I've known him.
I feel very honored, and I will rub this in his face. This is how we'll start things.
Please don't. He's very large. Well, height-wise, anyway. Again, so are you. So, anyway.
Well, Evan, thank you so much for agreeing to be on our podcast. I know we have had a lot of conversations over the years, and it's good to finally get the rest of the world to listen in on all the amazing things that you and I talk about behind closed doors.
Whenever I think back, I always think back to that time, like at a time when no one knew what location data was, and it wasn't even a thing. You were standing there talking about how like you could use it and you could salt the data and put out false signals. And it was like, man, that's just like 10 minutes into even doing this and already thinking about how to use it for evil. But it's what I love about you, so it's great.
And that is how System2 has been able to stay in business over the years, maliciously. Well,
if you understand what everybody else is doing to mess with it, then you can, counter program that and go from there. So you just have to have the right mindset for white hat hacking it.
Yeah, no, we do have a thing here at System2 where whenever we're trying to learn something new, we just Google videos of like that thing plus the word fail and just get a sense of what it's really like to, learn skateboarding or surfing or data science in this case. So
if you want to watch skateboarding fails traditional, it's not really true anymore. It used to be you could just go out to Union Square and just watch the kids out there. They were very bad at it. It was like where people started in New York to be bad at it, then they went somewhere else. We don't go outside, but you're terrible at this. Why are you all bad?
Yeah, I think New York skateboarding scene, at least in that area, is more about being seen than actually being good at it. It's more living the lifestyle than actually being good at it. But are you a skateboarder?
No. That is, I'm barely coordinated enough to stay on this chair, much less to stay on a skateboard. No, that would have been that would have ended very badly, I think.
Amazing. Well, Evan, I would love to hear more about your story. I was looking you up before this, and even though we've known each other for a while, I was still learning some new things about your background. And take us back. Who is Evan?
Yeah, so grew up in New York at a time when I don't know. New York was a very different place. It's always enjoyable when people are like, "Oh, New York is getting so dangerous," whatever. It's like, were you here during the '80s? Because it was very much a different transaction. So I grew up in the city, went to college up in Boston, got originally a degree in physics. And I was old enough that back then when you had a physics degree, they were like, oh, you clearly want to go work in a physics lab. And I said, I would like to go into finance. And they said, no, that's not something physicists do. And now you get a physics degree and they immediately make you a quant. But back then people didn't know that was a thing. So I ended up and got a theoretical math degree.
How did you know you wanted to not do physics and go into investing?
Because during college, I actually worked in a number of physics labs, including one that later won the Nobel Prize, which at the time was the single largest funded project for the National Science Foundation. And having worked in that government lab and had that experience of seeing what that was like, I did not enjoy it very much. And it turns out, and then I worked in a very theoretical lab that was never going to see the light of day doing nuclear fusion. So it would have been very trendy this week. I was ahead of the curve. Basically, it was just physics got done in places like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Argonne, Illinois. And I was from Midtown Manhattan, and I was not going to live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or Argonne, Illinois. So it was very much like, how do I get back to New York, and what do I do? And at that time, it was basically consulting and investment banking, and ended up in consulting for a number of years. From there, ended up in private equity. Then did a turn as a distressed debt investor at a hedge fund, and then moved from there. Realized I am not a good investor. I enjoy supporting investors. I am not a good one myself for a variety of reasons.
How did you figure that out?
I realized that just like I did not enjoy reading bond indentures. Just I don't think I've ever made it through a full bond indenture cover to cover and stayed awake. And so it's just one of those things where it's like, it's hard to be a good bond investor if you can't read bond indentures. It was also made somewhat more challenging by We were doing all our investing in Latin America, so they were all in Spanish. I do not speak Spanish, so I had to manage that piece of it, and it was fine, but it wasn't. It just wasn't what I was best cut out for. And then moved into the research side, worked for some of the early expert networks, and then found my way into the hedge fund space, and have been doing versions of what we now call data strategy and data engineering since before we knew they had names. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting time.
It's amazing. How take us back to the early expert network days. There
Yeah.
was, I'm sure, there were a lot of stories from back then. What was it like?
I mean, so I worked for an expert network that was owned by S&P at the time called Vista Research. The day that I actually went in for my final interview there was the day there was an article in the New York Times talking about how the Department of Justice was looking into the expert network business. So that was an interesting day to go into to have that interview. It was really interesting because it was, really, I think when I think about the things that we do in the data space now, and a lot of the understanding the people that are out there and the interesting things they're working with. Having built those connections in the early days of the expert network business, meeting a lot of people, that's actually where some of the other folks we know from, around doing some of the things we do, Kirk McCune and those kind of people, first met them at that time doing those kinds of things. Really, the virtue of being old as you and I are, is you meet people and then 15, 20 years go by, and if people are still in the business doing things, they're doing sometimes more senior, more interesting things, and you've built these deep roots, and you can have very interesting conversations, and people are surprised, and they're like, oh, how do you know all the things about the data business? Because they don't realize that, as we know, the data business isn't that old. It just hasn't been around that long. So, it's really something that if you were doing this 10 years ago, you were very like you were there right as it was starting. And so that's it really. I think that's all it is.
Where do you think the alpha has migrated to? If you look at research more broadly, expert networks are still very much a thing. These fundamental funds still pay them a lot of money. Why is that? Why, we have all these data sets now, and we're still talking to experts. So, yeah. How do you think about the research function more broadly for a fundamental investor?
I think the expert network business is always an interesting one because there's a lot of people who look at it from a distance and they think things and they're like, oh, people talking about things they shouldn't be talking about. And I don't think it's that at all. I really think that when you look at, the skill set of what becomes, analysts and folks like that, they're young people with a lot of brains and a lot of energy, but they haven't spent, 20 years in, the technology business. They haven't spent 20 years in the energy business. They haven't spent time understanding these things. And so, when they say like, oh, work with credit card data, they haven't spent years understanding how a credit card transaction gets processed. They don't understand how that comes through, why it looks the way it looks. So there's a lot of utility in just talking to people that have spent time doing that. As for some of the roles we sit in, because we've done these things for a long time, there are things that we know like that. When people say like, oh, how does this work? And you're like, well, let me tell you how CUSIPs work. And they're like, oh, why is that? That makes no sense. And it's like, well, they were around a long time ago. And in real ways, all of that built-in systematic DNA never really leaves. And so if you understand how the pieces all fit together, you can explain things in a logical way because of where they evolved from. And so I think, on an expert front, there's understanding those things. The business of all of these things has become dramatically more complex. The level you have to get down to of understanding in order to really start finding alpha and breaking things out that people haven't already explored, that hurdle is much, much, much higher or lower, depending on your point of view. But really the need to figure out more of it and get to more of a richness of it is just greater. And so, you see people, whereas back in the day, they do like 100 calls with 100, store managers to get a broad sense of things. I think nowadays you see people doing, 50 calls around just understanding a technical topic because they really need to understand it to see how that's going to play out and affect the business and the larger businesses. It isn't anything to do with like, oh, what's the stock price doing in an hour? It's more to do with just let me understand this problem so that I can use the data that I'm getting from other sources, but understand what they're really telling me. Because if you look at like an oil and gas pipeline, that's a very complex thing. And where the data is coming from is really, really hard to get your head around. So that kind of stuff.
Yeah. What are you finding yourself or some of the investors that you're working with relying increasingly more on ChatGPT to do some of this background research?
I think people are trying to. I think the general sense across everybody really is that it's obviously a profoundly useful tool. It's a great way to get started understanding things. I think if you really have to rely on it for anything, that's obviously a dangerous proposition because it can be wrong on the fine points in any way, really. But if you say like, hey, how can I just get like a quick survey and get going and sanity check things and see what's happening? It's an incredibly valuable resource and it's moving so quickly. So I think people are using it for a lot of things. I don't think anyone's relying on it as like an endpoint for anything. And if they are, I wish them well. It's a very aggressive stance to take. And certainly I'm aware that there's a lot of, regulatory and other forces that are looking into that because they want to make sure people are being deliberate and intelligent about it. But as a tool to explore and see kind of what we can do to, as a matter of process, work things more quickly, it's tremendous. And I think especially as like a coding resource, obviously people are using it for everything, where the turnaround times, I mean, I saw some folks out there posting about, I think it was the new version of Claude that came out yesterday. And I said they were playing with it for a few hours, and they said the results are already just unbelievable. The amount of output you can generate in a very short span of time that previously would have taken days, weeks, months, years of programmer time to get it there is really remarkable.
What do you think that does to research budget, research teams? And it's not just ChatGPT, but I'm thinking more broadly, a lot of these tools in the alternative data ecosystem or just the research ecosystem have democratized access to this kind of information. I remember
So much.
like when I started, having a Bloomberg was seen as a sign of, okay, like there was a hierarchy within the fund where certain people like the Miller back office didn't have access to some of these tools. At the end, it's asymmetric information where certain people have access to that information. And just by that very virtue, you are more intelligent about the work itself. But now you have, TGIS, you can very easily and cheaply get access to experts. You have Canalists, like modeling. That was another thing I remember when we first started. Like, you had bragging rights for being able to model things. And now it's, I can just download it with one click.
I will say that the first time I met the Canalist folks and I saw those tools, and I thought back to when I was doing that like Spanish language like stuff back in the day that I wasn't very good at. I half cried because literally the amount of time I spent building that stuff that like literally was like, man, you could have just gotten that straight from somebody now. And like, oh, would it say just, oh God, it was like my whole job. It says a lot about the fact that you don't need people to do that job anymore. You shouldn't need people to do that job anymore. And the tools you're getting are dramatically better. But it really does speak to exactly what you're saying, that the ability to really focus in on the very specific skill sets that are worth something. And different people value them differently. I mean, there's people that'll use those tools and people who just don't believe in them because they have a different process and a different approach. But it really lets, I think, everyone who's got the knowledge and awareness of the scope of what's available to them really say, what are the 5 or 10 or 12 activities that are useful and valuable that I want to focus on? And then you can outsource basically everything else to somebody and really drill down on like, here's the thing I do well that I see my value prop is sitting in. And that's it. I mean, that's all it is. I think the thing that the LLMs and everything is doing is it's changing what's possible in that scope and the degree of customization. Whereas before it was like, look, everyone had to have the same flavor of something because that's what a tool was. Now it's like, make your own tool, make it express your own preferences, make it do your own version of what you're doing. And that's really, really interesting. And we're only, just scratching the surface of what that can be. But I think, the potential of it is literally limitless. So
If you were that young version of Evan today, having access to these tools, do you think you may have stuck around with investing? Because I think part of what you were saying is just an aversion to really boring, tedious things. And now a lot of that has been automated, which is honestly, I think a lot of smart people have, where it's just, I want to focus on the bigger picture. I don't want to go through all this like boring stuff. But now that a lot of that is automated, do you think you'd want to, if you're young today, would you give it a shot?
I think I would have gone down a rabbit hole of, and still do, and it's hard not to, going down rabbit holes of exploring like intellectually interesting things that may or may not have like value and monetizable results from it. I think one of the things that's fun about kind of, what I've been doing for the last number of years is you can think about the monetizable elements and you're working with people who have to spend all their time thinking about the monetizable elements, but that I can have the luxury of taking half a step back and playing with things that are interesting. And if they end somewhere monetizable, great. I have the people that can really take advantage of that. And if it doesn't, it's kind of like, well, that's not my full-time job. So I can try to figure out interesting things. And if it doesn't work out, other people get to pay the price for having wasted their time on those kind of things. So it's a little bit of a luxury sitting where I sit and have sat. That's, Yeah, I think it's why I like sitting here, honestly.
No, let's talk more about that. So you, throughout your career, you've been at places like SAC that have historically been very innovative. They've spent a lot of time thinking about fundamental research and spent a lot of money on that as well. And to your point, now like there are other companies, venture capital backed companies that are spending other people's dollars on solving these problems. So you don't necessarily need to internalize that R&D as much in house. How do you? I guess maybe start off with your experience at places like SAC and what innovation was like then versus what it is today.
I think the part that's always interesting and simultaneously like disheartening, and I can't remember. Are you the one who told me that you coined the phrase like "data's the new oil"? Are you the one who said that? That like you were the one who said that originally, or something, or was it somebody else? I can't remember.
I don't think I wouldn't take credit for that, but yeah.
I can't remember who it was. Somebody I met told me that they take credit for saying that initially. And I'm sure they're gonna say this and like be very cranky about it. Be like, how do you not remember? It's like I'm getting old. I can't remember everything anymore. It's it, all the things that are really cutting edge in terms of like how far people are pushing things forward, and at the same time how many things are not being pushed forward, and how in some ways you'd be like, man, don't you think we'd be 50 steps further beyond that now? And there's a lot of reasons why not. And there's like reasons of plumbing and reasons of process and reasons of cleanliness and reasons of, hey, look, you can do fine with what we've got. You don't have to buy, $100 million widget in order to get things done. I do think there's been that push pull in the space for a while of there's a lot of things that are valuable. There's a lot of things that seem to me, at least, that they should be more valuable than the value that's been realized from them to date. It is interesting to me the degree to which the couple of folks that are really committed to like running far out ahead continue to innovate in that space. I'd like to think that, the places I've been, the folks I've worked with, I don't know if it's why they think having me around has utility or whether it's just the DNA of the place or whatever, have been, some of those leaders in doing that kind of thing. And by the same token, there's plenty of people out there that are wildly successful where we all see like, some league table of names of things, and you see like a thing and it's like, wow, those guys are dramatically larger than I ever would have realized and clearly are doing well. It's like, I never see them at that. I never see them at the clubhouse get together. It's like, how does that go? And it's like, apparently they're just forging their own path, which in and of itself is an alternative path nowadays. If people are taking, the path of going to, alternative data events and doing those kind of things, and they're never there. It's like, maybe that's, it's interesting that they found another path to riches or success or what have you. So I think all of those elements are really interesting. I continue to find it also interesting the degree to which the larger world hasn't necessarily caught on, in the sense like you would think that everyone would be doing this all the time, that you'd go to a conference or what have you and you'd see the Fortune 10 companies there exploring these things, and we know they're doing certain things in the data space and other things, but not to the degree that I think we would have expected. If you had asked any of us 5 or 10 years ago who's going to be here, we would have been like, everybody, just everybody doing everything will be here for all the things. There was one data conference a number of years ago, there was a pizza place there. It was like going around and getting data. It was like, oh, this is it. This is the turning point. Didn't turn as much as maybe we thought it would have. And it's always a little disheartening that that's the case. And then, we have friends like there's a guy who, was, doing a lot of research in sort of the financial services business. They're over at, a large insurer now doing some things, and talking to him. He's like, look, it's a lot of work to get the internal data together. He's building data lakes, and it's always fun to me at a hedge fund when people talk data lakes, and it's like, hedge funds are not data lake kind of environments, generally speaking. That's more large company sort of, ways of thinking about things. So it was like a data lake house. It was like, oh, we're going to have like a data ski chalet now. We can have a data, every form of residence. But it is interesting to see how people are trying to get there, but all of the ingrown challenges to each space that they're into to really doing the really exciting work.
What you mentioned some of the early companies in this space. What are some companies that surprised you, either positively or negatively? Like people that are still around, they're like, there's no way I thought they were going to be around, or vice versa. Companies that you thought were, end up being vastly more successful than you'd ever anticipated.
I think it's interesting to see the folks that have really adapted and changed. Like, I think one that's a great one to think about is a company like a Yipit, where they were like scraping guys, and like they scraped some things and had like 8 or 5 or 10 products. And by virtue of needing to adapt with the marketplace, they've built, this significant data science function. And a lot of the data scientists that grew up there are now, at funds doing things. I think they're publicly traded now, whatever. They built these lovely successes from that. That if in the early days you've been like, do you think these guys are going to be the data science incubator for whatever? You would have been like, that's not an obvious thing. I don't think it would have been obvious to them either necessarily. There are lovely products that people always liked a lot that I think have gone on to bigger successes. AlphaSense in the early days of what they were doing. I know that there were the users I had at Blue Mountain when I was working there, like people loved it, absolutely loved it. And they built that success to grow and absorb Tigas and Catalyst, as we were just talking about. And they've done great things. Others that maybe aren't around as much as they used to be, honestly, I wouldn't want to call them out by name. I also don't necessarily remember them because they're not foremost in my mind. But, folks that have dropped by the wayside for a variety of reasons. And, styles change, marketplace changes. It's an interesting challenge, and you adapt and stay ahead, or it doesn't work out. But it has been interesting over the years to see the folks that have really been successful throughout and what that means. I mean, I guess one, a good friend of mine used to run at Estimize. They were, doing really interesting things through the years, and then for a variety of reasons, it didn't quite keep working. And I know they've been acquired and they're still in existence, but not, what they were back in the day. And it's interesting to see how that plays out. But again, how even some of the, long-term data pioneers, the Raven Packs of the world and others, have been like reinventing themselves, with the bigdata.com things they're working on. It's been very interesting and heartening to see lovely people that we know well, seizing the opportunity and doing great things with it. And hopefully there's space for everyone to do everything and get bigger than just the hedge fund box that we're in, because there's so many other people that can use these things. It would just be nice if they did.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think that some of these examples.
And I apologize to anyone I didn't mention by name just then. I love you all. It's just, my brain only works so fast.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's also been funny to see how it changes people, how all these trials and tribulations of running startups are also impacting individuals. To your point, I think that's a lot more about adaptability than it necessarily is about, I don't know, like raw intelligence or anything else. I mean, there's plenty of really like smart people that I was looking up to that whose companies have not become as successful as I thought they would be.
I mean, speaking as the CEO who's running a startup, I mean, like the gray beard is a little because of just the age thing, partly by having young children, but maybe also the stress of running that thing, and through a pandemic and a bunch of other things that none of us had on our bingo card ahead of time. So
exactly. And then, but I also love the other side of it, right? Folks who have gotten very successful are now like screening your calls. It's like, oh, I forgot who we used to hang out 10 years ago. It's same bar, and now it's like, you're a big deal. But it is.
I will say in the career path, there was a period where I worked for the Quandl part of NASDAQ, and the founders of that business, did very nicely for themselves and are now, doing kind of their own things quietly because they don't really need to work for others and don't so much feel like doing it. And it's great when I catch up with them and see what's going on. But certainly there have been folks that have, timed things well and worked out well. The former CEO of Canalist is a good friend. He races cars for a living now for enjoyment. And it's always nice when lovely people do well.
I agree.
It would be nice if everyone could.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? I don't know. I sometimes like to see people fail, but just only my worst enemies.
No, that's what Google is for. You put in the thing and put in and you go,
Exactly. Talk about some of the exits that you've seen. You mentioned Quandl. I feel like there was, I don't know, maybe it just seems that way, more M&A activity a few years ago, and that seems to have slowed down a bit.
I think that's the classic like cost of capital conversation that people have been having, a lot, and that money was, the future value of money a while back was less than it is now, and therefore, people were willing to take flyers that they're less willing to take, and obviously there's seemingly a lot more uncertainty in the air these days, and that will be contributing as well. But I mean, you still see things happening. I think for the right situation, and who knows? But yeah.
No, but I remember some of those valuations where companies were getting 10, 15x revenue multiples. And now, even with this AI tailwind, we're getting some calls on the System2 side, and they're offering 5x EBITDA. You're like, isn't that quaint and also probably very realistic? But at the same time, I want that on revenue and more, you know? So it's, yeah, it's the, I agree. I think that the fundraising environment has shifted quite a bit.
I'll say it's not the space I spend hardly any of my time. It's the thing I know least well. I am aware, obviously, like we've seen some, like Pronto NLP being, recently acquired by S&P, whatever. I mean, there have been some things like that happening, and I think it's, for the right situation and the right piece of stuff. I mean, look, you do see things moving. It's just, you need a really, hopefully a high quality piece of stuff moving to somebody for, a very fair, if not over market valuation for what it is. And if people are willing to pay that for what's really good out there and well built and those kind of things, I think it there's utility in that. I think what you're not seeing as much of is the folks, saying like, oh, I just need this thing because it has the letters AI on the end of it, or oh, it's got, ooh, it's a data, ooh, it's alternative. I think there's probably less of that, but I can think of, 5 or 8 or 10, really, really compelling products out there that are, still finding their market, but should they get to where they ought to be? If somebody called me and said, look, do you think, this thing is worth, a ton of money because it's really differentiated? I can think of a few things that fall into that category. I hope they do well. I think they're great products. They're founded by great people. Who knows?
Yeah. What are some of the things that you like these days? Give out some shout outs to the people.
Yeah, no, I'm not going there. Sorry, bud. That's
the,
not going to end well.
No, all good, all good. How do you feel about the conference space? Are there still a lot of new vendors and products that you're discovering? I know you obviously you're pretty well known in the conference scene. How has that evolution changed? Or maybe to ask it a little bit more broadly, like, what do you think the value proposition is these days? Like in the beginning, a lot of it was just on sourcing data sets no one else knew about. How do you feel that that's evolved?
I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there's 4 or 5 different constituencies that are playing there. And if I were organizing the conference things, or I was thinking about going to the conference thing, I am the least of those constituencies that I would think about, because like finding me isn't hard and lots of people know how to get a hold of me and I'm a pretty well understood quantity. So like my set of personal preferences is like, I think it's great that people are willing to pay a lot of money to get a lot of my friends together in a room so I can see them all at once. And it's so much easier than catching up with them individually. But that's a relatively small subset of what's out there. I think there's always some new folks coming to the space, and that is interesting. And the ones that I think are most interesting to me are when you see the folks that are coming in from another area, not so much that it's like a startup new data company, not that those aren't interesting in their own right, but when you see like a large established player in, doing whatever and doing credit cards and doing, I don't know, post office boxes and doing whatever it is. And suddenly they come along and go, oh, we're thinking about, bringing data to the world, to this world. That's really interesting to me, because if you call up a startup company that you've heard of and say, hey, how do I get data out of you? There's like 7 people. You can find the right person to have that conversation with in 30 seconds. If you call up some enormous, I'm making it up, if you called up Walmart and said, hi, I want to buy the data, good luck finding if there's a human in there who could even do that or whatever. So when you meet someone from an organization of that scale, and they say, oh, I'm the person tasked with doing this, that connection is worth a lot, because finding those people within those businesses is not easy. And even if you knew other people, they can't necessarily find those people. Also, and this is the joy and delight of getting older, and I'm sure you've seen this as well. You go to these things and it's like, oh, here are the people representing a variety of organizations. And it's like, I remember the person 3 people ago from that person, and 2 people ago from that person, and 1 people ago from that person. So meeting the new energy and the new people coming in from these places, 1, makes you feel very, very, very old. But 2, it's also nice to kind of see that perspective. And for those people, they're new to the thing and they're meeting all these people for the first time. And seeing that perspective through their eyes is interesting, because it lets you know where the world is in a way that I think one of the things I've noticed having, as I do this and like for a long time, and like in speaking with you and speaking with our friends, you assume everybody knows the things you know. And the people you talk to are largely the people that have a lot of very similar experiences to you. So you and I get together and we know a lot of the same things and we share the same war stories and we think like, oh, everybody knows these kind of things. And then somebody comes along and it's like, wow, you didn't know any of those things? Really? But then there's the things that they know where they're like, how did you not know how this works? And it's like, I don't know. I have kids closer in age to you than I am. Okay, what can I tell you, man? But like those are the things that are good because that information feedback is also useful. And that's how you find out what's new and interesting and also very humanizing in the sense I was at a bank conference a while back with a bunch of heads of AI talking about the interesting, fascinating things that they thought were the most cutting edge. And one of them was like, yeah, I just got access to this like this morning. And I came home and talked to my 14-year-old. And we've talked, my 14-year-old is a somewhat unusually precocious individual when it comes to programming. But I said, like, oh, here are these great things we're talking about. And he's like, I've had access to all three of them for 3 weeks and I'm on the beta for this. And we've moved past that already. And I was like, seriously? He's like, yeah. I'm like, maybe you should be like talking to the heads of bank AI. And honestly, I'm not sure it's a bad idea, but like that's where we live is a time when, the younger people are bringing something really energetic and interesting because they have time on their hands because they're not dealing with kids and all these other things. So they can invest energy in the new AI thing or the Substack that's doing something amazing or whatever. And I'm not doing that. Perhaps you are, but I am not. My
Yeah,
commute isn't long enough. So
no, yeah, it's a very fair point. And no matter how young at heart I still feel like I am, there is definitely a level of
yeah,
cynicism when it comes to new things. Like, oh, I've seen 5 versions of that already. I'm not gonna try that anymore. But
yeah.
then you do miss out on some of the ones that are actually
Correct.
interesting. On that point, what advice do you have for a new head of data at a fund who hasn't been around the block as much as you have? What are some of the things that you'd want them to know? Both, I guess, even within the organization and like, yeah, also from maybe a technical standpoint.
Meet with everybody. Like the people that reach out to you. I mean, like, okay, maybe not everybody. If there's people that are offering the same thing where like the number of people that reach out and they're like, do you want a contact database for sales contacts? Whatever. It's like, no, that isn't my job. That's not a thing. That's not useful. But for people that are like, look, I have a data product and you're like, I don't have a use case for this right now. Take 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, meet as many of those people as you can. One, because the fact they're explaining a product a certain way doesn't mean that that's actually what it does. And they may not fully understand it. And if you listen to it, you may have ideas for them that, maybe they're willing to act on and do something and build something for you. But also meeting those people at various stages, it's an interesting fact that there's been a number of interactions that I've had and my wife has had, of recent vintage. She's, a senior executive doing a variety of things as well. And you meet people and they come up to you and they're like, oh man, a bunch of years ago, I heard you do something and it was so meaningful. And you don't remember them at all. And you're like, I didn't even know you. And you're like, oh, I feel terrible. But then you remember when you were first starting out professionally and like some senior leader from your organization would give a speech. And I remember like the first day I was at Millennium, the head of technology, he gave a speech and it was amazing. And I've quoted bits of that speech to people. He wouldn't remember me at all. I'm not sure he ever even knew my name in the first place. He had a big effect on my life and I had negative effect on him in any way, shape, or form. And that's how that goes. But if you take the time to meet with people and give them a little bit of your insight, they remember it and it means a lot. And the folks that I've had come back, 5 years later and say, these three things you said to me had a lot of value to us in the early days. And I want to show you what that is. And I owe you a debt. And you're like, I don't even remember doing it. But those things come back in remarkable ways to create very, useful, meaningful interactions and technologies and all these sorts of things. And especially when you're getting started at something, take the time because like those, you put $1 out in the world and it comes back wrapped up like $1,000 bill later or whatever, or just, it's just karma. I can't overstate the value of that. I think it's really just tremendously useful in all cases. And whenever I meet people and they're like, oh, I don't answer any of my email and I don't read it, it's like, why? Like, do the best you can. Like, it's not being a jerk is not required. So
I could
the main thing.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think it's about trying to be a good human being, and at the end of the day, it's what are we doing all this stuff for? I mean, yes, everyone talks about alpha and money, but the day-to-day stuff is much more, in my opinion, about the people. And exactly to your point is that you can pay some of this stuff forward and not even expect it to come back. But when it does, it shows you that, yeah, things are, people still look out for each other every once in a while.
I saw this video this guy posted of himself being cannibalized by his young child. And I mean, having seen that video, it's just like those cannibal children are the ones that we're doing the work for in the long run. I don't know if
Exactly.
you've seen it. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's great.
Oh, I sure have. I sure have. It's, yeah, no, kids, yeah, take everything, but they also give you some things in return. What advice do you have for dealing, if you're a data person, for dealing
Yeah.
with the investment professionals in your fund? They tend to be different kind of animals. Like, what's your
Um,
strategy been there?
um, In no way am I describing anyone I currently work with. Every single person I currently work with is the single best person I have ever met. They're all wonderful. And I cannot say enough good things about all of them, both individually and collectively. The people I've worked with in past jobs, however, it's more of I think it's again it's a little bit of that maturity thing of like when I was younger and doing versions of this, you get very caught up in the sense of like, oh, like people are being difficult to be difficult, whatever. And like no one's ever doing that on purpose. It's like people are trying to accomplish their goal. And the more you can try to understand where they're coming from, and in some cases, like ask them, be like, look, what is it you're trying to do? Can you put into words? And some people are very verbal and can communicate these things, and some people can't. To say like what are you trying to do? How are you thinking this through? Because the more you can understand that and take the time and the patience to do that, the more you can really give them value and deliver something back to them that they can work with and use. I think one of the challenges that I've seen is like, years ago when I was at Blue Mountain, we had a relatively smaller number of investors that we were working with. So I knew basically all of them on an intimate basis, very personally. So I understood like each of their preferences and what they were doing. And like, I could see something in the world and be like, this will be the thing that this guy can use. And I'm positive. And I go to him and be like, this is a thing. And he'd be like, I'm going to drop everything, all the things. And then, being at a SAC or Millennium or Verition or whatever, these larger organizations, it's not possible to know everybody like that. And so you have to figure out other ways to deal with it. And honestly, one of my biggest daily frustrations is the fact that I don't know everyone as well as I'd like. I can't give them that kind of like, really firsthand value. And it's frustrating to me. And I would love if there were an LLM that could help with that. But I do think that like realizing that there's just different kinds of people and understanding the interpersonal, how to work with like a quant is very different than a fundamental person, is different than a quantamental person, and seeing kind of what they can use and how they prefer. And is this the person who you talk to face, and this is the phone call, and this is the email, and this is the person who doesn't like, direct interaction, so they'd rather a database or whatever, and figuring out how best to manage each of those. And it's still something I work at today. I mean, there's people I work with who, will inform me at times they're like, and this will come as a huge shock to you or anyone who knows me well, will say, sometimes you can be gruff and abrupt. And it's like, me? How can you say it shockingly? And it's still something I'm working on all the time, as I think we all are, to try to, work more effectively with a broader range of people so that you can give them that value so that they can, I'd like everyone to be successful, and I'd like the work that I and my team put in to help them be successful. And that's always what we're trying to do. It's just, it's challenging. There's limited time and people are under a variety of pressures and people are different and you don't always know them well enough to be able to figure out kind of how best to work with them. I think a huge part of the job, both on the vendor side and the, internal side, is really figuring out how to build hopefully tons of goodwill all the time and always being kind, so that for those moments when you can't afford to be kind because something is really wrong or you need to communicate a message or whatever, you can deliver those hard messages and they're received in the spirit that they're meant, of like, we have this strong relationship. Now I need you to do something and understand that something bad happened here and you have to fix it. Or maybe it's like, we failed in some way and we have to communicate that, but hopefully enough goodwill's been built up that it's like, you understand that this is not an everyday thing. We're human, mistakes happen, what have you. Working through those kind of processes, I don't know if that's a coherent thought, but that's...
Absolutely is, yeah. I had a friend describe it as, in context of relationships, as putting money in the bank of marriage, so that when shit does go down, you have something to draw from, and it's just making these constant, like, small deposits into that bank over a long period of time, so that when
there's moments of time when you spill it all over the floor like Mickey Mouse with the brooms, it's like, yeah, hopefully there's still something in there, man.
Exactly. Yeah. So that applies to people at work as well. Just a broad generalization. This is for a friend. Most data people tend to be introverted. What advice do you have for introverts when your point was go out there, meet your stakeholders, talk to the investment team? What are maybe some small tactical things? Like, you're in the office, how do you go about meeting somebody else and starting to build that longer term relationship?
It's the hardest thing. I mean, the hardest thing in the world. And I think it's harder. The younger you are, the harder it is, because there's so many more layers of technology and everything else you can put between you and everybody else, by choice or by design. And people do that. Is like the hardest thing. Like people are like, oh, it's challenging to like walk up and just talk to people and communicate. It's not easy for anybody, but you do it, 50 times and you kind of get good at it and whatever. I mean, I remember the very first data conference I ever went to was in London. It was the thing that's, I think, now known as Quant Strats. I don't remember what it was even called back then. And I flew out to London, and I had never been to England professionally. I'd been there personally, but it had been long enough apart that like I didn't remember anything. My cell phone wasn't working, and I was like too cheap to like go like be like, I'll just turn it on in the UK. This was before like, you could roam anywhere for anything. So like I had very limited ability to get around and do things. Showed up, didn't really know a ton of people, and somehow it seemed like everyone knew each other already. And I was like, how is this possible? And the people that I met there, a great many of them are like my very close friends now from a variety of ways. But it's just like you walk out there and you just start talking. You just do it. You just put yourself in there and say, oh, this is uncomfortable. And you know what? The first time, I mean, do you remember the first time you and I met? I don't, but maybe you do. I don't know. It was a long time ago.
Yeah,
Somehow we met and whatever, but it's like all of those things start somewhere. Like the first time you meet your best friend, the first time you meet your spouse, the first time you meet your, professional, cohort, whatever, just go out and do it. And mostly people don't bite. Mostly people aren't there to try to like be miserable. It's not like, the high school lunchroom really. Jump in and do it and be uncomfortable and realize that I think the thing that's great about this business is a lot of people in it. I mean, like quants tend to be spectrumy kind of people in general. So it's not like these are the most natural humans. I mean, we can all think of people we know that are, very active in this space doing things who are not the most comfortable people, who don't always, dress the way people ought to dress. They don't, if we all dress better, we'd work in private equity, who like, comport themselves a certain way and own that, just like and realize that like people are, it's not a judgy population particularly. So, just don't be weird. Don't be creepy. That's always, it's like, don't be creepy. Don't go over to people and like put your hands on, like just don't do that. Just be a natural person interacting with people communicatively and ease into it. But those are just life skills, I think.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point too about conferences, because by definition, pretty much everybody is there to also meet other people. And so you find that one other person.
People at a bar, if you're at a bar, like they're there, or a club, they're there to meet. It's like, can you walk over and talk to people? They're there to be talked to. That's why they're there too. So,
Exactly.
If you go to a conference and stand around and stare at a wall, that would be weird.
Or find that person who is staring at a wall and walk up to them and be like, hey, and just start a conversation, right? Because they're also trying to talk to people. So I think it makes a ton of sense. Let's pivot a little bit to the types of investors, types of funds. You've worked for a decent range of funds in the past. Like you mentioned, that some smaller, some larger. You're now at Verition. How has that evolution played out in terms of what the data role means? And in particular, I know some funds, like there's a dichotomy between like the pod shops versus the single manager shops. And how do you see the data role for a place? And it looks like more of the world is shifting towards funds like Verition. What does that mean for your data role there?
I think the nature of data is an interesting one, because it's still not a role that in general people have settled on, like this is exactly the shape it takes. I think the way I always think of data is it's sort of the thing that in a weird blob fits in between the other things. And that like from inside a fund, the data people have to work with legal because you need them to review contracts. They work with compliance, which may be part of legal or may not, to like make sure you're, meeting a set of things. You're working with accounting because people need to get paid. You're working with the PMs, you're working with vendors, you're working with technology. You're kind of working with everybody. And so, but the exact shape that takes, I mean, as funds grow, somebody's doing a job and they're procuring things. And then at some point, either that person leaves and they go, we need somebody else to procure the things. Who's going to do it? We should go get somebody. Or that person, the job gets too big for them and they say, well, I want to handle this piece of the thing and not do this anymore or whatever. It evolves in a variety of ways, but it's not a thing that's a clearly structured box. And so because of that, it tends to be whoever vacates that box first, they say, oh, this is what we need. So we need a more technology forward version of this. We need a more, financially forward version of this. We need a more sort of legal and compliant, version of this or what have you. And then as you get to bigger places, you start getting, to the largest of pod shops, you see the roles have become much more granular, where it's like, this is the person who focuses just on quantitative data coming out of a bank that feeds into equity strategies in the United States. And it's like, that's one person's job. And it's like, hey, if you have enough people, I guess it is. Meanwhile, you've got a smaller fund that's, at least in theory, doing the same thing. And they have one person handling all the data needs, all of the procurement, including ordering the water for the water cooler and whatever. And it's like, that's the same person. Obviously, those two people are not the same person, or not the same kind of person, but nevertheless, the remit falls into both of their gigs. That's the interesting part to me. And I think it's about finding the right fit. And I think when places are looking for those people, usually they don't know quite what they have and exactly what they think of, like, here's the person who left and here's whatever, but they don't necessarily fully conceive of what that means. And then by the same token, when you're doing those things, it's like, look, now, how do you want to split this? Where should that be? What are the skill sets people have? I think for years, there would be places that would call and they'd say, I need somebody who knows all the data in the world and can load all the data in the world and can analyze it and come up with conclusions and all these things. And I was like, one, that's well more than 24 hours in a day of somebody's life. But two, generally, those skill sets don't really exist in their entirety in the same person, other than Tony Berkman. He's the only person I know that literally can do all of those things. But it was like, good luck getting Tony. But like everybody else is, the data, but you can't load. You're not a data procurement person, a data scientist, a data engineer. Those are not quite the same skill set for one human to have. Or manage a team of people. It's like, well, which one do you want them to do? Like switching between cover 800 vendors and 800 PMs and then dig deeply into analyzing one data set like that. I mean, this more than anybody. That is a very different person. That's a very different time scale. And if you're focusing on one data set and cutting it up, you can't then pull yourself out, do 800 things and come back and go back to analyzing that thing. That's a really tough switch mentally for anybody to do. So it's, you really have to decide kind of what people ought to be doing, how that ought to work, and fit it around the people and what makes sense. I don't remember what the original question was, but hopefully we got to it somewhere.
So no, it's super helpful. So I mean, are you saying that because of the diversity of the functions of these roles that you can't have one person doing it? And so does that mean that you need a team? How big does the team need to be? And then kind of tying that back to the funds themselves, like do the larger funds then have an advantage because they can hire a lot more people? And how do the smaller guys compete?
I think it depends a lot around just understanding what it is, again, where the real value is. Like what are the things where you're like doing a repetitive task and that's important, those things need doing? What are the things that are value added and where are you seeing those things and just where do you want to apply those energies? And as time goes on, it may be like, look, here's a set of functions that can be done in an outsourced way. Here's a set of functions that can be done in an algorithmic or LLM, AI kind of way. And just realizing that it's an evolving shape. And so the idea of like, it has to be this is the way it has to look, is like, you have to adapt to the people in the situation, and the marketplace changes. So if funds are growing and getting bigger, I mean, I was at Millennium a number of years ago. Back then we had me and one other guy who were basically doing all of what we would now call like end of day data engineering. I'm assuming that Millennium has more than two people doing that. It seems likely to me that you would need more than two people to run like all of the end of day data procurement for the entire place. But exactly what form that needs to take differs. And so you have to adapt with that. And more than that, adapt to the people you've got. I think the biggest challenge you see is if like somebody leaves and like we need to find somebody that fills that exact shape of the person that was there. Some of those things are skill sets that live in a lot of people or some measurable number of people. Some of them are an odd combination of things of like, you need somebody that does, I need somebody who sings opera really well, hits home runs, and also, I don't know, is a really great dog walker. It's like, that's very specific. I hope you find them, but it's challenging. Good luck. It's not really a thing that tends to coexist. So
how do you prefer to work? Do you like to be more of an individual contributor? Do you work better on a team? Like, how do you think about the team around you?
Yeah. I mean, I need to have my hands in things. Like I don't know how not to do that. If it was just purely a managerial function of saying like, tell people and you just sit back, I am not equipped to do that. That's not my DNA. I'm way too anal. I'm way too much of a control freak for that. I think beyond that, it's really a question of the people. I mean, you know this more than anybody running a business is, you know, the people there, you need to hopefully empower them to do as much as possible and do as much as you can to clear things out of their way so they can get that done and hopefully do it in a way that they find useful and hopefully put them in a situation to grow and be successful and feel that they can grow into things. You know, prior to being where I am now, I mean, most of my prior gigs was really kind of a sole contributor kind of a thing for a variety of reasons. As we've grown, at Verition, not to talk too much about it, but like there has been some expansion there because just it's not something that's a one person job. I mean, you can look at any of the public information and it's a good sized fund doing good sized things, and that's not one person's job. But I think overall it's we all have to adapt and figure out kind of where we can best apply these things and work with the tools you and the people you have. So
How do you stay on top of new information? What's you read, you listen to the podcasts. How do you consume information?
yeah. I have an annoyingly short commute, so I don't actually have the podcast ability to do that. And I have children and family things that need things. So my ability to like lock myself somewhere and be like, I'm going to listen to this for a while, like that doesn't work in my life. But no, I think the biggest thing is really staying in touch with people in the world. And I think the biggest part of it is, you know, seeing people that reach out on like LinkedIn and via email and things like that, hearing what they're up to, going to conferences, talking to people regularly, taking time just to communicate across a wide variety of things and just hear all of the ideas. I guess what I say is I don't listen to podcasts, but I try to spend a lot of time around people who do, who can tell me the interesting things they heard, and try to pick that out and, you know, see what you can see just the best way you can and acknowledge that you're going to have blind spots and not ever think that like, you know, all the things. I'd like to think I know all the things, but I certainly do not. And every now and then when, you know, I hear about something that's really genuinely new and fascinating and comes in a way that, I wasn't expecting, those are the really enjoyable ones because those are the ones where it's like, wow, this is really cool. This is really different. And knowing enough to know when you see those and then say, now how do we do something with it? How do we take this and turn it into something exciting? Because we've seen 10 million things, but this one is different than the prior 10 million. And maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it's hard to be different in those 10 million things. So
I love that. In some ways, the art of having conversations is very underrated, or to look at it differently, it's like having an interactive podcast where you can ask questions and take it into whatever direction you want to take it into instead of just listening to other people. I totally agree with that.
this is the world we live in. A conversation is an interactive podcast. A magazine is an iPad that doesn't work right.
Look, exactly. You gotta rebrand.
Floppy disk, somebody 3D printed the save icon.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you got to rebrand these things to make them interesting for. We talked a lot about children and how to get kids to go back to some of these more analog ways, even though the digital stuff is so much more dopamine inducing. And
definitely the way to do it is just to say you're not allowed to do it and turn that junk off because that's worked well ever.
Speaking of which, what were you like as a kid?
I was as bookish and annoying as you would have expected. I was an only child in New York City, being as bookish and self-involved and whatever is and unathletic as every single thing would indicate. I know you play basketball regularly. That is not a feat, other than the fact that I topped out at height quite early. So I was a great ground-bound center until everybody caught up. Basically that was it really. It's what I am now is what I've been for a long time as far as that goes.
I love it. What was your routine like as a kid in New York City? Were there places that you'd go to, I don't know, like hang out, like to talk to people?
Yeah, I think the one that stands out was, so I grew up on the Upper West Side, and there was the time that, so I went to a school that wasn't quite a public school and wasn't exactly a private school, so it had a slightly different schedule than all the other schools. And so there was a day that it had a half day. And so I left school when school was over and I went to the Museum of Natural History. So I was like, I'm going to go check out the museum because I love it and it would be great. And I got there and the guard was like, you can't come in. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, you're cutting school to be here. And I was like, one, no, my school has had a half day today, but it's like, you think kids are cutting school to come to the Museum of Natural History? Like, is that really a problem you run into regular? And literally, he wouldn't let me in. I was like, because it wasn't like this was pre cell phone, so it wasn't like you can call someone and ask. But literally, it was just like, we're not letting you in. I was like, you think that I'm bookish enough to want to come here, but not so much that I didn't cut school? Just like very, so that was.
So what'd you do? You just went like, played in the park or something.
Yeah, I think I just went home. But I mean, like, I think the other memory of kind of growing up in the '80s and what that all meant was, so I went to school on the Upper East Side, and I grew up on West 68th Street. And so there were a couple of ways to kind of get home. You could take the crosstown bus and then come down, or you go down in that cross. And there was, and every now and then some friends and I would come home a certain way. We'd walk through the park because we were like, it's nice. We can do that, whatever. And I don't think we ever made it walking through the sheep meadow without being solicited to buy drugs because, that's what you do. And so there was one day, it was a blizzard. It was an absolute blizzard. And we had taken the M3 down to like 66th Street on Fifth Avenue. And so we were walking through the park because the crosstown bus just was not coming. And we're like, we'll walk through. And there was literally a foot and a half of snow. And so we're just like, we're going to walk home and it'll be fine and whatever. No one's in the park. And we get to, so like next to the sheep meadow, there's like, for a while it was a Le Pen quotidian. I don't know what it is now, but like this little shack right next to that. And there was one guy standing there and literally he was like, you want to buy drugs? And we were like, wow, that young man is going places because he is entrepreneurial. He realizes that if anyone is out today, that's likely why they're here. And so but like even on that day, we never made it through the park without being solicited. Even on the day there was a foot and a half of snow and not one soul alive in Central Park that day. So that's yeah.
I love it. And to your point, there's a lot of hustle out there. I was having this conversation with somebody about I went down this rabbit hole a few years ago about Genghis Khan and the Mongolians. And
Right.
one of the interesting facts about Genghis Khan's life as a kid is that when he was 6, 7 years old, he was playing with his older brother and some other boys, and they got in an argument. And as boys do, he shoots his older brother with an arrow and kills him. And mom gets upset.
Who hasn't been there, right?
I know, yeah. That's why you're the only child, The and so and his mom gets upset with that. I can't believe you killed your brother. And then they just move on, and things continue. His life moves on, a lot more experiences.
He was probably going to die of a major virus back then anyway. That was the normal course of action. That's why you had 12 kids.
Exactly, exactly. And they're like, but if that boy lived today, he would have spent. I mean, his whole life was in institutions, right? Like that's it. And back then, and not just back then, but for big chunk of human history, people that were doing those kinds of things were the ones that end up being successful. You're working in 2 feet of snow, selling drugs, and all the other kids are staying at home watching TV.
It's funny you say that because the one that I do wonder sometimes, and again, it makes me seem old and dramatic, is like, so our older son was when he was in high school, mentioning the fact that like there was some statistic that like 52% of all people, their ideal career was influencer, but it wasn't that 52% of like young people, it was like 52% of everybody. And it was just this idea of like, so pre, social media, pre the internet, whatever, like if you're an influencer, what would your job have been before? Like in the 60s, like what would you have done for a career? And I remember when I was at Blue Mountain, there was a particular influencer of some note at the time who like their persona was like one of being like a larger than life, kind of like very masculine individual with like, I shoot guns and I do this and I do that and I do the other thing. And he actually reached out to me somehow at Blue Mountain and emailed me and was like, hey, I'd like to come by and pitch my like financial product thing to you. And there was no way we were going to do anything with it, but I really, really wanted to meet him just to ask him that question and find out and be like, are you really like this? Like, is your persona your real shtick? Or like, is it that you're actually a business person? Because like the email was like, oh, here's how we're monetizing this and commoditizing this and our metrics and this, that, and the other thing. And I really, really wanted to meet the guy. And the people that were sitting there was like, wouldn't that be cool? And they were like, yeah. But if they came by the office, they would have probably filmed it, put it on the internet. And that is not something that my employer would have been a fan of. But I really, really wanted to find out and kind of get to the bottom of understanding that process. And I'm still very curious about it, to be honest.
Have you figured it out, or you're still waiting for the day to meet him?
It hasn't really come up, and I've just accepted as one of those things that maybe I'll never know.
Yeah.
So.
there's certain mysteries in life. Yeah, we'll never get to the bottom of.
Some things we're just not meant to know. We don't know how many licks to get the bottom of it. So we'll never know that one either. So it's just there's things you can't know. So yeah.
Exactly, exactly. What are some things that you're excited about today?
You mean like today, right now, today, or like in the general, like larger today
The
sense?
larger, even today, whatever. What's happening? What's on your mind right now?
I mean, I think all of the eye stuff, honestly, is the most interesting problem out there. I mean, like it really, there's just so many interesting things that it can speak to and it can do, and has a lot of potential, and just oh man, it's just so exciting to think about that, but also it's terrifying. And when you think through all the things that it's going to disrupt and all the people who have, lovely jobs who maybe don't necessarily have a role going forward because of the things a computer can do or will be able to do shortly. That's very interesting. I mean, I'm very excited by the fact that people are moving back now to the idea of having nuclear power as a thing we can have. I've been a fan of it since I was doing fusion research back in college. I would not have guessed on my bingo card that the reason we'd be doing it was to power a bunch of LLMs. That would not have been my guess as to why we would go back there necessarily. But I do
At
think
least we're not mining
it's
Bitcoin.
exciting.
It's at least we're powering some other things.
Very definitely. I think those are a lot of the things that I'm excited about. I'm not excited about the Jets' upcoming season. I'm very, very nervous about that in all the ways.
What's
But
going on with the Jets? Like, is yeah, any changes or?
but I don't know. Their owner just got an F in the NFL report card and was the only one to get it. So, as a family that had tickets since they were the Titans, it's a lot. Not surprising, but it's a lot. Um, Other than that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm excited about my kids. I'm excited about the normal things people get excited about. I don't know. What are you looking forward to, bud?
Well, it's one day at a time. It's sunny today. It's getting warmer. This weekend's gonna be a little
Yeah,
nicer. It's things like that. And I don't know. I think like part of it too is just surviving one day at a time. Being back here in 10 years and still being in the game. And
I'll tell you though, that's the real secret to so much of this. Like when I think back to like my kids' lives, so much of it has been like these moments that are big deals for them. It's just like I hope we get past this and don't scar them. It's like, can you make it past like this birthday and like it won't be terrible? Can you make it past like it's like they're at college now, like now they're on their own, like we didn't ruin their life yet. I don't know, a lot of things are like that. You just kind of go through it and you find you're there and you're like, we made it. It's working.
yeah, no,
Um,
I agree.
I don't know what that means. I think I don't know if that's the secret. It's interesting to me when people look at like the founding of the country and they're like, founding fathers were wise, and it's like the founding fathers were like 28. Like why do we think they had different motivations than we do, or they had some incredible otherworldly wisdom? It's like no, they were just trying to get through it, same as us, and not get hit by like a stray bayonet or like a random like rifle thing or somebody or
Yeah, no,
same challenges.
I totally agree, and I think a lot of it is just like just sticking through it and trying to enjoy the moments as much as possible, like reframing things. The that's someone who was talking about whenever you're having a shittier day to reframe it as at least I get to have these kinds of problems, and there's certain positions.
Was it also a line they call it the present because every day's a gift? It's hokey as hell. It's hokey as hell, but it's a good line, man.
Yeah, yeah. No, for sure. Like how many people, to your point, want to be influencers, or they want fame, they want power, they want money, and then you look at some of the people that have some of those things, right? Look at the people with power. I just saw an article before this about Zelensky meeting Trump, and
Yeah.
trying to get support, and that meeting only lasted 30 minutes. I was like, Zelensky's having a lot shittier day than most people right now, and it's like
Yeah.
that's the life, and like a lot of people want to be in that position to be like, oh yeah, I'm the president, I'm the person like leading my country through a period of turmoil. So the founding fathers example, and yeah, but the day to day, it's like, oh man. But at the same time, like at least he gets to have those problems, and that's what he wanted. It's what a lot of people would want, but it's it's not easy.
I hope it's what he. I mean, I don't think anybody wanted that, but it's I don't know. I mean, if anything, I think the more people that I know who on paper and visually are doing great, everyone is dealing with a lot of things. Like just I think the more that people are honest and upfront with like, look, challenges. We all have challenges. We all have things we're dealing with. We all have familial situations and work situations and health situations and whatever it is. And the more you can be truthful about that and not be like, oh, everything's perfect. Like, no, nothing's perfect for anybody. And like, if you can just, it's interesting to me that like, so our younger one just finished a school project for the picture of Dorian Gray. And they asked him to, rather than write a book report on it or a formal literary essay, they said, like, can you take it and do some kind of commentary on modern society about that? So he made a website that's like in the style of TikTok, where like one of the lines from Dorian Gray is one of the characters says, like, influence in any form is bad. It's bad as a matter of science. Like, no form of influence can be good. And like, this is a thing Oscar Wilde wrote 100 years ago. And it's like, yeah, talking about the influencer thing. It's like, like, can you influence somebody positively? Is that a thing? Is that healthy? And, I don't want to give it away for anybody who hasn't, read the book, but it doesn't end great for Dorian. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I would love to see that website. Send it to me.
I will.
But
I will. It's actually a website. You can go through it. It's that's how he rolls.
well, it's a cool topic. Although Oscar Wilde was also the guy who said the worst thing, the only worst thing that being talked about is not being talked about. So there's some version of vanity and influence.
He wrote about the pernicious nature of influence while espousing a very hedonistic lifestyle, which also has a lot of modern analogs, as it turns out. So,
exactly.
But he was dealing with some stuff. He had some social features that were not necessarily very popular in Victorian England, and apparently also not popular in the United States in the year 2025 in half the country. So what are you going to do? Yeah, it's complex.
Sure is. But yeah, he's one of my favorite writers. I'd love to check that out. How'd your kids get into that? Sounds like a pretty creative approach to the solution. Like, what's your parenting advice do you have to get kids to turn out to do cool things like that?
I mean, mostly get lucky. I think, like sitting where we sit, I have no idea what the future holds, but I think even when the kids were little, there was a sense of like, look, programming is important. So I think, like, if nothing else, in knowing what we knew, my wife and I, saying like, look, try to get involved in that and push them towards that. And certainly, if they took to it, great. If they didn't, it's like, it's not happening. But if you had to pick a skill that's like, look, it'll be good for all the things somehow. So you get them involved in that as early as possible. Hopefully they like it. And if they do, encourage that. And it's like, it's a tool that'll be good for something. And it's remarkable to me that, like, I'm not bad with these things, but like our older one and our younger one, they whip out Python the way I whip out a calculator. Like, literally, if I asked them to add 6 numbers, they would write Python to do it because it's the way they think. It's pretty cool.
That's really cool. Yeah,
it's probably good for something. I don't know, but it's really it's remarkable and how and sort of they talk about like digital nativity and all that kind of thing and really how they've taken to that. Our younger one, that's what he enjoys very much. Our older one really thinks of it as a tool. It's not something he wants to be doing full time, but he uses it for lots of things, and his facility around that for everything he's doing really informs a lot of his process. It's really very interesting.
Well, it would be great to see what they end up doing with it.
Well, you've met him, so you that. Whatever.
I have no, but it is interesting, and it's like you also see the college version where, to your earlier point, and I'm guilty of this as well. We end up selling out. We may have had whatever visions of what our future and our career would be, and it's like, no, finance pays well, so I'm going to do that. And yeah, I'm curious how these generations, like, how they're going to make their choices as to how to apply all these skills and talents that they have.
It is an interesting challenge, and that, like, I know you're a fan of basketball, so it's interesting to me that, like, there's the sense of, like, I think the NBA is at the point now where if you are 6'5" or taller and have any kind of jumping ability and any outside range of any kind whatsoever, the NBA's recruitment process has gotten to the point where they will find every single person on the face of the earth who could possibly do that skill well, and they are getting all of them. And it really is like for people of a certain kind of ability and intellect and drive or whatever, the ability for the financial services universe to kind of capture those skills is really high and really interesting. But I do wonder what it means when so many people are moving in that direction. If they're not, I don't know, if they're not actually building things, but rather investing in those that build them, what does that mean in the long run? Are we going to not be building great things because the people that would have built those great, in the Genghis Khan example, 30 years ago, they would have gone out and built an amazing piece of engineering, but now they're like working at a VC fund, like funding people that are building not quite as great pieces of engineering. Um, I don't know. It's an interesting
Yeah, and
question.
I've come to appreciate the impact that the macro environment has on your career and what's
Yeah.
going on economically, what's going on socially when you come out of college, and it's no, it absolutely impacts your life in ways that you don't intend, and yeah, and so it's we'll see what kind of choices and decisions. Well, I look forward to staying in touch with with your kids and staying.
I look forward to staying in touch with my kids too. Hopefully they still want anything to do with me as they grow up.
I
It's not always the
that is honestly, I feel like I've talked to enough people where that's kind of the goal. It's like they still talk to me, so that's mission accomplished. Although, yeah,
job number one right there. So yeah.
my co-founder likes to set the bar even lower, which is he just wants to keep them alive, and that's the thing. And it's surprisingly difficult, especially when they're young and everything they're doing is bent on self-destruction. So
I do feel like that is the basic skill. It turns out if you're not great at that, and you go to the store and you say yeah, this model didn't work out, I need another. They are really not very understanding about that. If you're like, yeah, these three didn't work out, but the fourth one's going to be a win, they have no sense of humor about
they,
that. They also don't take returns weirdly. If you go back with the receipt, they look at you weird.
that's the
So yeah, I don't know. Very
the
strange.
business model that we can now start.
Very much so.
Well, Evan, it was a pleasure chatting with you. Yeah, it's really nice to get to know you better. So I appreciate you coming on and chatting with me.
It is my true pleasure and always will be.
Cool.